Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast, and today I'm talking with Christiana Miller, who is a social media creator whose content often deals with issues of Christian faith with an emphasis on matters relevant to women. Well, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
How's it going?
It's going great. I've been spending my morning writing music.
Yeah, and that is what you do mostly?
That's what I'm trying to do mostly. I grew up singing with my family. My mom is a songwriter, so that's kind of what I've always loved doing. And so I'm trying to get more into that on my own.
Trying to build that for yourself.
Yes.
And you have quite a following on Instagram, and you have a following on Twitter as well. That's kind of how we know one another, from Twitter.
Yes.
That should help with getting a music career off the ground, I would think.
I hope so. Yes. I just released my first song, which was actually one that my mom wrote for me when I was a little girl. It's called The King's Daughter. And so I just released that. And then I've been working on some original music as well.
Where could people hear that?
It's on every streaming platform right now. Spotify is the main one, but yeah, it's everywhere.
Well, tell us a little bit about, before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about your background. You told me a little bit offline about how you grew up, because I think having that context will help people understand where you're coming from in the rest of our conversation. So Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I was raised in what would be technically classified as a cult, but is known as the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement. And that is a subset of Christianity. And I was born into that and grew up in that. And my family did full-time ministry. So we were part-time from about the time that I think we started going to different churches when I was like 8 years old, and then did that on and off until around 2010. And then we started to go full-time. And by 2012, we were full-time in traveling ministry. So we lived on a tour bus and traveled the US and Canada, and we sang in about 100 churches every year. And my entire teen years were lived on a tour bus with my family. I have 10 siblings, and 2 of them were born while we were on the road. And then my dad was offered an assistant pastorate position in the Midwest. And so we ended up settling in 2017 and kind of stopped doing ministry in the full-time sense, but we were a pastor's family for a while. And then I ended up kind of deconstructing some of the things that I had been taught, and then reconstructing a lot of things, and decided to leave my dad's church when I was around 20 years old, which was a difficult decision. I was still living at home. And then he ended up resigning from that position in 2020. And so my entire family is now out of that movement. Praise the Lord. But I've since then kind of just been on this journey of figuring out, like, what does the Bible actually say about women? What does it say about men? What am I supposed to do with the things I was taught that were wrong and were harmful? How can I help other people unravel some of those things? So that's kind of what I've been on a journey towards doing, and have healed a lot from that, and have felt like I'm in a part of a really good community now that is more truth focused and less legalist focused like it was before. But yes, that's a very small snippet of my background. But
what are the hallmarks of the independent fundamentalist Baptist movement? What is that like?
Well, it's a very patriarchal movement. Women are not allowed to have any sort of authority, any sort of voice, really. I was a very opinionated young woman even as a little girl, and there were people who would tell my parents that they should look out for me because I was a little bit too opinionated, a little bit too headstrong, and grew up hearing that since I was very, very young. And so I was always kind of not welcome because I just didn't fit the stereotypes of what women were supposed to be. And so I tried to conform to that and like make myself into this version that they wanted me to be. And it just was never working. And so then I fell into this feeling of like, God must have made a mistake, you know, by making me this way, by giving me this strong personality, this independent spirit, these like leadership gifts. I was like, what am I supposed to do with all these things? If I'm not allowed to have these because I'm a girl. So I did have some sort of identity crisis along the way where I really genuinely thought my life would be better if I was a man, because then I would be able to use these gifts that God's given me. But as a woman, like I can't because I'm not allowed. And so that was really difficult for me growing up. But we were also very heavily involved in purity culture. I don't know if you know anything about Bill Gothard or IBLP, but
Tell us about it. Were you involved in that?
We were adjacent to IBLP, and we used a lot of the curriculums from Bill Gothard. So a lot of the, if you know, like the umbrella theology of like for the household authority, that was a huge part of our teaching, but also all of his like homeschool curriculums, all of his teachings on marriage and that sort of thing were heavily involved in our movement. And so I still have some of those books that I now use to study and to research and help me as I make content. But that was the mindset that I grew up in. And so as a girl, it was really difficult to feel like I had a place in the world at all, other than just needing to be like subservient to men. And so that was difficult for me. And then when I came out of that, I was able to get into a much healthier community that didn't view women as lesser beings. So I'm really blessed to have a better view of God now because of that. Because I think for a long time it made me feel like God hates women because he created us, you know, as like a lesser life form. And I wish I hadn't been taught that, but also on the other side of it, it's given me a lot of opportunities to help other women who feel that way. And so I am in some ways grateful that I have that life experience to go from.
Were you taught explicitly that God created women as a lesser life form, or was that an implication of what was taught?
Well, there's actually a book that I read or reread not too long ago, and it's by Debbie Pearl. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Michael and Debbie Pearl.
I am actually, but
Okay.
maybe not everyone listening is. Tell us about it.
So Michael and Debbie Pearl are another very well-known couple in this movement, and they wrote a lot of books. And in Debbie's book, which is called Preparing to be a Helpmeet, I think I was given this book when I was 16 or 17 years old. And it was kind of this like, here's the guidebook for how to become a good wife. But it's basically all about how to survive domestic abuse. If you read it, it's kind of like, it's like, here's all the things you need to do if your husband is like hurting you. And it's really not, it's a really, really bad book.
What does she advise you to do?
Well, she'll say things like, firstly, she does teach that men are made in the image of God and women are made in the image of man. That's what she does teach in that. And so she'll say that women are genuinely a lesser life form because we're not made in the image of God. So that is an explicit teaching in that book. And I know that she gets that from her husband's books, he would probably tell that to men too, that women are not made in the image of God. So that teaching is explicit. But then she will say, like, if your husband gets really angry at you, that's a sign that you've disrespected him and you need to just be quieter or submit more, and then he'll stop doing these bad things to you. She'll say things like, men are useless when it comes to the sick and the helpless, and you shouldn't expect them to help on a sick bed. Like, you just shouldn't expect them to have empathy. You shouldn't expect them to be gentle. And so really teaches women how to identify all these red flags as actually just masculine traits. And she would describe like a narcissist and say, this is just a masculine man. So she has 3 types of men in her book: the prophet, the priest, and the king. Okay. And has these different attributes and says that these 3 different types of men represent the Trinity and the 3 members of the Godhead, which is interesting. But she would say that the prophet is this visionary man who always wants to get things done and he's always pushing things forward. And if you're his wife, you're probably going to hate your life because he's just going to be uprooting you all the time and he's not going to want to help around the house, and you shouldn't expect him to because he just has all these dreams, and you should just let him. If he makes bad financial decisions, you should just let him because he's going to learn the hard way, and that's okay. But you just need to support him. And then the priest she's like, you're going to resent this man if you marry him because he's more gentle and he doesn't speak up for himself, and you're just going to hate that he's not a strong spiritual leader, but you need to just let him, be weak anyway, but you're going to wish you were married to somebody else. And then she'll say that the king is like, she'll call him Mr. Commandman. And she says that she's married to a Mr. Commandman. And if she's like, if you do this, you can't expect him to, show empathy, want to help sick people, want to be gentle with anyone. He's going to boss you around, and he's going to leave you crying in the dust. If you cry, he's not going to be your shoulder to cry on. So don't cry, just suck it up. Like, these are the explicit teachings in that. And if you look on my Instagram, I do have a couple of highlights where I go through her book and actually did highlight a lot of the passages. And I also did a full review on her book. So if anyone's interested in seeing a little bit more of the actual things that she says in there, you can see that on my Instagram. Because nothing I'm saying right now is an exaggeration, even though it sounds fake. And as I was reading that book again, I was like, I can't believe that anyone would read this and think that this is normal. It's so bad.
Yeah, the pearls have been a massively destructive force in evangelicalism. And it's interesting because on one hand, they aren't really mainstream evangelical figures. They're not going to end up teaching at Liberty. They're not going to teach at Wheaton. They're not going to be invited to speak at Calvin or any of these places that sort of define what mainstream evangelicalism is. And on the other hand, Debbie Pearl's other book, Created to Be His Helpmeet, I think it's called, has sold millions and millions of copies. And so they have managed to have a massive influence without being part of the mainstream of evangelicalism, because the gatekeepers of mainstream evangelicalism recognize them as basically crazy. And yet somehow their teachings have been so widely promulgated. I don't know, perhaps it's through things like the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, but I don't know where they come from. They got there.
Yes. Well, when my mom was a young wife, she does remember that her church purchased cases of that book, Created to Be His Helpmeet, and passed them out to all the women, and they had studies on them, and they would all just sit around and talk about this book and basically made that kind of the owner's manual for their marriages. And you mentioned Michael's books. I haven't actually read Michael's book. I'm kind of afraid to. But in his book, I know in the intro, I've read the introduction, he basically describes his honeymoon as him assaulting his wife multiple times and her not being an active participant. And then kind of laughs it off, and he's like, haha, I wasn't a very good husband at the beginning. But I was like, oh no, these are criminal offenses. You're describing really bad things. This is not normal. But then kind of just saying oh, she forgave me, and she just agreed that we all make mistakes. But so it's very crass the way that he talks about his wife. It's very unkind, and all these things that you see, if you have any normal interaction in the world at all, you're like, this is hugely problematic. But when you're in fundamentalism, like I was, you are taught that this is what the Bible is saying because they speak so confidently, and people like Bill Gothard and Michael Pearl, I think that's honestly how they get such a big following, is because they do know how to command a crowd, and they are very charismatic in the way they speak. They're eloquent, and so they come across as if they actually know what they're talking about. But all they really have is stage presence, and they don't actually have any real substance once you look at what they're saying. And especially Bill Gothard would tell people that the highest thing you could do is get married and have as many children as possible. And yet he was single and childless Like, and so I'm like, I don't know how anyone could take these people seriously. But like you said, millions of people do. And it is because of movements like IFB, which still has 8 million
Oh,
approximate
wow.
identifiers. So it's pretty widespread in the US. And like my family traveled to 100 churches a year. We've been to every single one of the lower 48 states in that time, which means that there's at least one church in every state of this movement. There's a heavier concentration in the South, like the Bible Belt has a very heavy concentration. I'm talking like every corner has an IFB church down there. But it depends on where you are in the country. But there also was a documentary that just came out about it. You might have seen the Let Us Pray documentary, Prey. That's about the movement that I grew up in. So a lot of the names mentioned in that documentary are pastors who I either like I sang for them in their churches, or I was somehow like connected to somebody who did know them. Almost every single person in the documentary I was somehow connected to personally.
You mentioned you deconstructed a lot of things. What does that mean for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm careful of using the term deconstruction because I know that it can kind of be misunderstood and blown out of proportion a little bit. And some people, when they say the deconstructed, they mean like I no longer identify as an evangelical or I don't identify as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I still do identify as an evangelical Christian because I believe that the word evangelical doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't mean that I endorse American evangelicalism as it stands right now. It simply means that I believe in the good news of the gospel. Like that's what the root word of evangelical means is like, I am someone who is bringing the good news of the gospel. That makes me an evangelical. That doesn't mean that I believe the same thing that all mainstream evangelical Christians believe,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't shy away from using that term because I think it's a good descriptor. But I would say I deconstructed a lot of the things I had believed about like men having to have all authority and women not being allowed to lead or share opinions or things like that. I definitely deconstructed things like purity culture. I deconstructed, but I do feel like I reconstructed the most important things on a better foundation.
Was there something that happened to you that was served as like the final straw that kicked off that process?
Yes. So we stopped traveling in 2017. And then in 2018, I really just started to re-examine the things I was doing. So there were certain rules like women aren't allowed to wear pants in the movement, not allowed to like drink alcohol, not allowed to, like get certain piercings or tattoos, things like that, little things that I had always just been taught were a sin, not allowed to listen to rock music because it's from the devil, things like that. And so I just started asking my dad these questions and I was like, why do we do all these things? Like, who is it for? Am I doing all of this to please God or am I doing this to make other people like me? Because if it's to please God and you can show me in the Bible where he says to do all these things, I'm in. Like, I want to do this. But if you can't, then I'm out and I'm not going to do it anymore. And I'm going to go and find out what God actually wants me to do, what's most important to him, because I've been told that all these things are what's supposed to make me a good Christian, but all I'm getting out of it is fear. All I'm getting out of it is identity crisis and depression and anxiety. And I was like, the Bible says that perfect love casts out fear. So I was like, if this is what God wants, then why do I only have fear? Like, why do I feel like God hates me? So I started asking those questions. And then my dad, I'm very blessed to have a father who was not afraid of my questioning and who was willing to look at the things with me. And eventually we came to the conclusion, we were like, yeah, these aren't in the Bible. Like, God says for women to be modest, but he doesn't say for them to not wear jeans. Like, I'm like, God says that you shouldn't be drunk and excessively immoderate with alcohol, but he doesn't say that you should never touch it. So things like that, where I was like, so these were not the correct teachings. And so I started to kind of unravel those things. And I was like, okay, but if the Bible doesn't say this, then what does it actually say? So trying to take on a more moderate view of scripture, and also just a more historically accurate view of the context, like the cultural implications, like what is scripture saying culturally, contextually, apart from what my fundamentalist Christian nationalist childhood always told me. Because I thought, another big thing for us was like the end times and the rapture and America is like, all these prophecies hinge on America. That's kind of like the Christian nationalist thing. And it's like, they actually don't though. So like just figuring out a lot of those things, and mainly just trying to figure out like, how can I stop being afraid all the time? Like I need to know that, God doesn't want me to live this way. And so once I started doing that, all the people who I knew had a very bad reaction. And I was 19, 20 at this time. I was very confused by that at first, because I was like, what do you mean you don't? I was like, you don't understand that I'm trying to find, like, I feel like God is giving me all these revelations of like, wow, this truth is something I haven't seen before. And I felt like I had learned all this amazing stuff about who God was. And I was like, you don't have to live under this fear all the time. Like, look how great this is. And they didn't think it was great. They had a really terrible reaction. I was called two-faced. I was told that I was trying to go against God. I was slut shamed for like wearing jeans. One of my dad's best friend, who was the best man at his wedding, and was a pastor who I considered a second father, told my dad that a picture of me where you could see my shins could make him stumble and have sexual thoughts. And for my parents, my mom was like, we don't let 60-year-old men say that about our daughters. Like, we just don't let that happen. And so there were some things that went on where, things were said that we were all like, what, like, there's no way you can actually be saying that. Like, that's not okay. So those were kinds of the things that happened. But I mean, I was basically shunned. And so once that happened, I really reevaluated what I was doing, because I was under the impression that we were all connected because of our mutual faith. And it turns out we were just connected because we all looked the same and because we were all doing the same things. And so once I stopped living like that, I was no longer allowed to sit in the circle. And so I was kind of pushed out. And there are people who I grew up with, who I've known since I was born, who I have not spoken to in over 6 years because of this. And as hard as that was, I can now see that God was removing things from my life that weren't helping me grow. But it was really painful to go through. And I still do want for all those people to see that there is freedom for them and that they don't have to live that way. Like, my ultimate desire for them is that they go through the same thing I went through, not like being shunned, but that they can understand, like, God doesn't hate you and he doesn't want you to be afraid all the time. And I have had some girls come around in the past few years who I knew as a kid and who were like, hey, I actually need help because I'm leaving and I don't know what to do. So I've always tried to keep that door open for them, but I was definitely shunned.
When you look back on all that, how do you feel? Are you angry?
I used to feel more anger. Now I mostly feel sadness, I think. It's more of like a grief, because I can understand that they are brainwashed and that they really do think that they are defending Christianity, but they aren't. And so it's like, it's hard for me to see that, because I used to be who they are. I used to be that same person who would see someone do what I did and think, you're leaving the faith. Like, we were told that if a person does what I did, that they're jumping off the deep end, they're going to the world, they just hate God, they're going to, they're running to the devil. That's the sort of thing. So we always just thought like, oh, that's true. And then I became that person. And I realized that a lot of those people who I thought that about just, were doing the same thing I was. And they were a few years ahead of me. And I was like, oh, that's what happened. It wasn't, and not all the time. Like, there were kids who did leave the faith. I don't necessarily think that's because they hated God, though. I think it's because they kind of got to the end of their rope with a lot of things. And I mean, I could have left the faith. I had reason. So I'm very thankful that God revealed himself to me the way that he did. But yeah, I feel a lot of sadness when I think about it, because I want them to have freedom.
It's interesting on the more hardcore, if I don't know, let's say fundamentalist fringe of Christianity, right? Leaving the
Mhm.
faith can be defined so broadly, it really just means becoming a Methodist.
No, actually, though, because that's so accurate, because my dad he would say that he was not a card carrying IFB. He was always very compassionate for everyone and really had a heart for he really just wanted to share our music. A lot of my mom's music is very comforting, and he wanted people to hear it. And so we would travel to Presbyterian churches every once in a while if they wanted to have us. And then I remember him saying a few times, he would say, "Don't tell anybody that we went here because they won't have us in." And so it was kind of like we would sing at the Methodist church, we would sing for the Presbyterians, but we couldn't tell anybody
Right.
because we
Yes.
had to do all that under.
That's such a strange part of something like an IFB movement. It's such a strange part of it for me to try to understand is how people can have such a narrow view of what the faith actually is. So to the
Mm-hmm.
point where like becoming a conservative Presbyterian is counted as no longer being Christian or whatever. It's so strange to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, they believe in infant baptism, and that's just that's the deal breaker.
That might be it.
Or they don't carry the King James Bible. That's a huge thing in IFB. All of my scripture memorizations are still in the King's English. It's just it's those things that are the deal breakers. And as silly as it sounds, they will stop associating with someone who uses the NIV. My cousin was he is a pastor now, but he was a missionary in Zambia, Africa, for a while, and he told me the story that he was with a missionary friend, and then they were with another missionary. So there's three of them, and they ministered with this man for like a week or so, and then when they left, his friend said, he's like, "Yeah, it's just too bad that guy's not a Bible believer." And my cousin was like, "What do you mean?" And he was like, "Oh, he doesn't use the King James." And so they equate not using the King James version with not believing the Bible. And when you say it out loud, it just sounds so silly, but that's the deal breaker for them. It's like King James Bible, even though it's not even the most accurate, it's not even close to being the most accurate translation. They do genuinely believe that they think they could correct the Greek with the King James Bible. And they say that from the pulpit.
I've heard that, yes.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I invited you to record today is that on Twitter, you have found yourself engaging in some dialogue about male-female relationships, which is quite the topic, especially kind of in our corner of Twitter, if you want to say that. And was it yesterday you wrote about the bear, or
I think
recently?
yeah. I mean, a different account who I follow, I think, opened up kind of a discussion about that, whether or not a woman would rather encounter a bear or a man in the woods. So I didn't originate the conversation, but I did participate.
Yeah, but you posted a tweet about it, right?
I did, yes.
Yes. So frame that question for us again, and then let's talk about it.
Yes. So the original post was from a friend who asked the question, or I think she put up a poll that said, if you, as a woman, were alone in the woods, would you rather encounter a bear or a man, a strange man? The assumption is you wouldn't know the man. And I think that the poll ended up being fairly even. between some women said they would rather a bear, some would rather a man. There was some different reasoning, so I weighed in on that a little bit.
And what did you say?
I think it's more of a nuanced question than just an easy yes or no. There's a lot of things that can go into it. And I've seen a lot of other women sharing their reasoning behind why they might choose a bear as opposed to a man. So I can't say, 100% for sure would I rather choose a bear or a man, because there are just so many different deciding factors in the scenario. But I think there are a lot of different reasons why women would choose a bear versus a man. And I think that a lot of the commentary I've seen from men around the conversation seems to indicate that they have a little bit of a misunderstanding of why women feel that way.
Why is it that women don't unequivocally say they would prefer to encounter a man in the woods?
Well, there's a lot of different reasons. A few that I have seen and that I can resonate with are statistics show, I shared a little bit of that yesterday, is that statistics of being attacked by a bear is like 1 in 2.1 million versus the statistics of being assaulted by a man. It's like 1 in 4 women have reported being assaulted by a man. So that in itself, obviously women encounter men on a more regular basis than bears. So that's a bit of a skewed statistic. But at face value, it's easy to think like, well, if I was in the woods and I encountered a bear, firstly, wild animals typically don't want to interact with humans. They're often more scared of us than we are of them, especially, I've been out in the woods where there are bears before. I've seen them in the wild. You make a lot of noise and they usually run away. If you don't try to provoke them, if you don't try to pet their baby, if they're not starving and, famished, then there is a much smaller chance of them going out of their way to hurt you or kill you. It's just not likely to happen. Whereas men are more unpredictable for a lot of women. And the thought of meeting a man in the woods who you don't know is extremely intimidating for women, just because a lot of women have been assaulted by men. And there are a lot of news articles you can read, a lot of stories about women who went hiking alone and encountered a man and something really bad happened. And so I think that for women, it's more so like weighing the option. It's like, well, I would take my chances with a bear.
You weigh in from time to time on the larger discussion there on Twitter about, say, women's roles, about the way men approach women, about the way that men and women think about one another, especially maybe in Christian contexts. What have you noticed overall about how that conversation goes? Because there's a lot of it right now.
Yes, I do. I think that my main demographic, like the people I'm talking to most often, are people who have a similar background to myself. So it's important to make sure people know that, because someone looking at my page who's never experienced anything like I have might think that I'm a little bit of an extremist when it comes to some of the things I'm saying. Whereas if someone has come from a background like mine, they can see very clearly, they're like, yes, this is a very specific issue within a specific subset of Christianity. This isn't a whole Christian issue. It's just like this one particular group that's doing this. So when I talk about issues like purity culture, I think, being on a platform like Twitter makes it really easy for people from all different backgrounds to weigh in, which I think is why I can often be perceived as so controversial. Whereas if it was just the people who I'm actually speaking to, it would be a much smaller pool of interactions. So that's something that I think can be a little bit misconstrued, is that I'm saying something that's like a blanket statement, where it's usually like, I know I'm speaking to this particular issue in this particular group. So that's something that I wish people would understand a little bit more, is that I'm not saying all men do a certain thing, but when it comes to the bear man discussion, as someone who grew up in the environment I did, I'm very thankful that I had a very protective father. He was very careful about never letting any of his daughters be alone with a man, and also told us all the time, never ever be alone with a man, because he was very intuitive and he knew that things could happen, and he was always just trying to be one step ahead of the bad thing happening. And I think that the reason I was able to escape mostly unscathed is because I had such a conscientious father who was always looking out for me and making sure that I was never in a situation where something could happen if he had anything to say about it. And a lot of girls weren't so lucky to have that. So, but I mean, coming from that background of knowing like these things can happen, I also know probably I couldn't count on my two hands how many men I know or know of who are pastors or youth pastors who have spent time in jail or are currently spending time in jail because of child sexual assault charges, or because they had some sort of thing happen with a teenager in their church or a little boy or a little girl. So once you know all of that too, it can kind of make you question, like, who would I rather encounter in the woods?
One thing you see on Twitter a lot is a group of guys I have referred to often as the Theob Bros. You familiar with the Theob Bros? Yes.
I'm so familiar with them.
And they are very busy trying to create sort of limited roles for men and women. And it's very difficult to engage with them. And I think this is something that you're trying to say, is that without knowing kind of the background from which you come, okay, it could be easy to perceive some of the comments that you make as almost as if you're a very far left feminist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But actually, you're just trying to pull away from and speak to this sort of hard fundamentalist fringe.
Yes.
That doesn't stop the Theob Bros from sort of mischaracterizing people who have a more moderate view. And so I suppose what I'm saying is that in a lot of Twitter discourse about male and female relationships, you have many people who characterize all moderation from their extreme, overstated, simplistic views as feminist, when in fact, that's probably not the case.
Right.
And have you encountered that?
Oh yes. I've been told that I'm demon possessed, actually. I've had all sorts
What got you
things.
called that?
Just the average things I talk about. But it is the Theob Bros and like the red pill manosphere type of men. And I think there's a lot of overlap between those things. I think that the red pill and the Theob Bros kind of, they or are holding hands. But yeah, I've been called left wing before, or a radical feminist. And I really am still pretty traditional in my real life, in my real thinking. You know, I don't hold to like the patriarchy like I used to. I believe that women should be able to share their opinions, and that they should have rights, and they should be allowed to make decisions, and that women can be rational human beings, and that we should be allowed to vote and things like that. And that if that makes me a radical feminist and a crazy person, then they're gonna just have to think that. But I just can't take them seriously, because very often these Theob Bros, who even are pastors in like their real life, will refer to women using slurs online, or really
I've seen it.
Coarse, gross language. And I just can't take that seriously. because it tells me that they don't actually want something good for women. They don't actually want to be wives and mothers in like a healthy context. They want slaves. They want people to take care of their children. They want women to cook meals for them. That they don't actually care about women being healthy in those things. And until they actually start loving women the way that God does and like seeing them as whole human beings who are deserving of love and being heard and cared for, then they're not going to see any sort of positive response from women. And I don't think that they should.
Why do you think they don't love women?
Because they don't believe that women are made in the image of God.
It goes back to that.
And yes, it goes back to that, is that they believe that inherently men are superior to women. If you look at their talking points, they'll say that women are not rational. Women are not able to have a conversation without getting emotional, or like men just are smarter and they're just better at doing things, and women can't make choices. And like women need to have a man in their life telling them who to vote for and what to think about. And that's exactly the way I was raised. It was like your dad tells you what to think until he passes you off to a husband, and then your husband tells you what to think. And they frame it as like, I was just reading a book that I found in my car. It's called Me, Obey Him. And it's by a pastor's wife. And she is talking all about how to be the most submissive wife, but they don't actually mean like submission in the biblical sense. They just mean complete surrender of all your rights to another human being. It's essentially slavery. And they would frame it as selflessness and as, wifely love, but it's not actually those things. It's just slavery. But she says in that book that, her life got so much better when she just stopped trying to contradict her husband on anything ever. And I'm like, yeah, because you're letting your husband be a teenager. Like you're not actually, respecting him. She would say that she said in one part, I understand the feelings of revulsion that women could feel towards their husbands. And I was like, oh, I don't think that's normal. I'm like, I don't think you should be feeling revulsion. Like revulsion is a really strong word. But they tell you like, this is normal. But if you feel repulsed by your husband, just go along with what he's saying. Like, just do this. But then that teaching goes back to women are lesser beings and they don't have the ability to make good autonomous decisions.
You are a young, unmarried woman.
Yes, I'm 26. Yeah.
And how do you, from your particular vantage point, see the resurgence of these ideas affecting whether or not men and women can get married, and how men and women in Christian or evangelical contexts relate? I think I started reading red pill material probably 20 years ago, and I've been amazed at the power with which it has emerged into real life mainstream social realities. And I'm just wondering if you see any implications from that, from your vantage point.
Sure. Yeah, I think that first of all, a lot of it is more prevalent online than it is in real life. And when I talk to men in my real life, it's a much different conversation usually than what is happening online. There's a lot of extremism online, even though a lot of those people who are online are offline in somebody's life. And so that's kind of unfortunate to think about. But I do think that men are more balanced in real life. And I've had a lot of really wholesome interactions with men who do respect and appreciate women. But I think that a lot of it with the red pill stuff is like young men just ingest these things from guys like Andrew Tate or, Theob Bros, who just say all this stuff about women, and they say it confidently, like it's true. And they just take it as gospel truth. And they just assume, oh, this is true. This is how women think. This is what women like. This is what, women don't know what they actually want. So you just have to, stuff like that. And they just make all these assumptions, and they project a lot of their own issues onto women. And I think it's a lot of that's what I see online, is a lot of projection. And so especially, there was a recent thread where guys were trying to tell me that women only want to go out with men who are in the top 1% of good looks. And I was like, well, that's objectively untrue, because first of all, attraction is so subjective for women. You have no idea what women are attracted to. But because they would only go out with women who are in the top 1% of looks, they think that women feel the same about men. And I'm like, okay, if you would go outside and walk on grass, then you would see that this is not true. Like, if you would actually just interact with women in your real life, work on getting a personality, like, just try to make at least one joke, like, lighten up a little. But I think it's a lot of projection, because they see these really confident personalities saying all this stuff about women. And it's like, you don't have to do all these things that you think, like Andrew Tate. I'm like, first of all, he's not someone that should be respected at all. I'm like, he is not a person to look up to in any sense, but he's very confident, and he says things like they're true. And so people listen to him, and young men are easily influenced by that. And I think that especially if a young man doesn't have a good father figure in his life, he's more likely to be influenced by that. And so, but I mean, I don't see nearly as much of it in my real life as I do online, which I'm very grateful for.
Sure. It seems to me that a lot of what we encounter online is young men who maybe they don't even know it, but they're really quite desperate for love. And
Yes.
They have been, unfortunately, taught some things that make their chances of finding it even slimmer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing for online red pill gurus to say women are attracted to you when you behave in a masculine way.
Mm-hmm.
It's another for them to lay out almost this ideology that tells young men that you must be this certain thing, and any slip up or variation from this ideology will get you rejected, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it is reflective of a crisis among young men that much of the church is not equipped to handle either.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. I do think that's true, unfortunately. And I think that also, like you mentioned, that these things were coming up 20 years ago. I think we're kind of seeing the results of what was being taught 20 years ago. Now those little boys who were hearing that they were hearing that men shouldn't cry. They were hearing that men aren't empathetic. They're not gentle. They were hearing all those things as a kid. And now they've grown up and they've kind of turned into the monsters that the red pill was creating. And it's really unfortunate, because like you said, I think they are really looking for love, and they don't know what that's supposed to look like. And they don't know how to love. Firstly, because they don't love themselves, because they repress a lot of their emotions. They don't properly process what they're feeling. They don't really even know how to articulate it. It's rare to be able to, even guys in my real life, there've been times when I'm like talking to them. I remember I have a friend recently who told me that he was going through some really hard stuff. One of his family members was having some health complications, and he would say it, and then he'd be like, it's fine though. And I was like, are you okay? I was like, you don't have to be okay, like, with that. Like, it's okay to feel sad that person's going through that, and that you're close to them, and that it's like, it really hurts that you might lose them. Like, that is not a thing that you need to repress. But because so many young men repress all these feelings, it manifests as anger and as this hatred toward women who they don't understand, because they don't understand themselves. They don't understand their own feelings. And then women obviously respond badly to that, because it's like, how can you expect them to respond well, And so then you get, especially online, you get into this back and forth where it's all about like how one side could do something differently or the other side. But I think we both obviously have things we need to work on. And a lot of the time, the reason that I'll speak more to like, why, what is the way that men can stop thinking this about women is because I genuinely want to help men think differently about women. Like, I don't want you to all end up sad and lonely forever. Like, I want you to understand that like this thing you were taught about women is wrong, but they don't often take it that way. They usually take it as like a personal attack. And I'm like, I need to figure out a way to communicate that this is not an attack. This is me trying to help you. This is me trying to be your big sister.
All right. Last question. What do you wish they could hear about women that they're unable to hear?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a huge misconception that the majority of women do not want to get married, do not want to have children, want to be alone with their cats, want to not have men in their life. That is not true. That's not true. Even a lot of women who I would identify as feminists, they still want to be married and they still want to have kids, but they are not willing to give up their independence for a man who openly hates women and says terrible things about them or doesn't view us as a whole human being. So it's like, yes, I do want to be married. I do want to have children. I do want to be in a healthy, loving, flourishing relationship. I am not going to sacrifice the life I have right now, though, for someone who talks the way that these guys do on Twitter. I'm like, I'm just not willing to make that sacrifice because why would I? Why would I do that? And so while the overarching thought from Red Pill and Theob Bros is women hate marriage, it's not true. But they don't want to be married to these guys who are spewing all of this stuff at them. And I'm like, you can't expect someone to want to be with them. And so the reaction seems to be more based on an assumption. And I wish that wasn't the case. I wish that it was easier to articulate for men and women both, like what are the actual core needs. And unfortunately, we live in a time where everything is just online, and that's where people discuss things, and that's where things are processed. You can't hear voice, and you can't hear nuance. And especially on Twitter, it's like you have 280 characters for most people, and you can't express everything you're trying to say. And so I think it's difficult to break out of that. But I think that conversations like this can help that to happen. But it's definitely a long process, a slow moving train.
All right. Tell people where they can find you if they want to follow up.
I have Instagram and Twitter mostly, and my username is Woman of Valor, WOMNOFVALOR. And I'm working on getting a website set up right now so that I can get speaking engagements booked and stuff like that. I have music on Spotify, Apple Music, whatever streaming platform. So you can find me. It's just Christiana Miller on streaming platforms. So you can find me there as well. But yeah, if people have questions, they can definitely send them and I'll try to respond.
All right. Well, thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.